We are moving on to session 3 here. This is going to start on page 6 of your notes. I think page 6 is on the back side of a page, so if you have any trouble finding it there, maybe look on the back side of some of the pages. I hope you also noticed, let's see, I don't think I had one of these for session 1, but for session 2, I know at the end of that portion of your notes, there was a QR code there you may have seen that if you'd like to, hear somebody else talk about the whole issue of relativism and the objectivity of truth, I put a link on there to one of my professors. Well, actually, he's the professor who's going to be evaluating this seminar. So I'll have to answer to the man here when I talk to him in a couple weeks. But he had a good presentation on truth and the objectivity of truth that you can find on YouTube. And so that QR code will take you to a video of that. And so for sessions 2 and 3 and 4, I know I have some QR codes there for you, and if you'd like to explore some of these topics in a little more depth on your own. All right. Hopefully you'll remember I had said at the beginning of session 2 that in the remainder of our sessions, we are really just defending a pretty simple, straightforward statement that it is true that God raised Jesus from the dead. It's a pretty straightforward statement, but as we're already seeing, those are some pretty staggering claims involved in there, right? So we've talked first of all about what it means for a statement to be true, and that if it's true for all people. So in this session then, we need to talk about the God part of that claim. We are saying that there really is a God who exists, who could take an action in our world like raising Jesus from the dead. For that statement to be telling it like it is, there really has to be a God who exists, right? And so we'll defend that now in this session. Now, I hope you already understand. Yeah, you've seen it here. We're talking about an argument for the existence of God. I hope you already understand that when I talk about making an argument for the things we believe, I'm not talking about an angry fight. Of course, that's one of the ways we use that word, isn't it? But that's not what we're going for when we're trying to winsomely defend our Christian faith. In this setting, in this context, when we talk about making arguments, we're really talking about what we sometimes call a train of thought. And that really is a great analogy, a train of thought. Because if you think about a physical train, all the different cars on that train are hooked together, right? They're connected to each other. So if one starts to move, it just pulls the others right along with it, right? They're all connected that way. And as we think about the issues of life, as we reason through questions that we're trying to figure out, ideas have a very similar relationship. They can pull each other along. What I mean is if you come to see that a certain idea is true, that has implications about other ideas that might be associated with it. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about giving people a train of thought where they would come to see, hey, if I believe this about the world and I believe this about the world, then I really should believe this about the world as well, because all of these thoughts have this connection to them where they pull each other along. So that's what we're talking about here. Making a case would be another way of describing this. I know probably not very many of us have spent a lot of time in a courtroom, but we've all seen courtroom dramas on TV at least, right? And we see the prosecutors and the defendants making opening arguments or closing arguments, right? And that doesn't mean that they're getting up there and they're angrily shouting at everybody. It just means they're laying out the facts and they're trying to persuade the jury to see and interpret the facts the way that they think they should be interpreted, right? So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, presenting facts, presenting evidence, linking ideas together so that we can convince someone that a certain idea really is true. So that's what we're talking about here. Now, over the centuries, and yes, I mean centuries, all kinds of different observations have been used to prove that God really does exist. We have a rich Christian tradition dating back into really the 100s AD, 200s AD, where we can go back and read the writings of various Christian apologists who have been making arguments for the existence of God. And over the centuries, people have used all kinds of different observations to help other people see that God really does exist. We're not going to go into depth on all of these because that would just take way too long. But I want to mention some of these because some of these observations might be things that you're curious about or things that perhaps you're already kind of knowledgeable about. And so we're going to go really into depth on the moral argument for the existence of God. But there might be some of these other observations that really strike a chord with you and that you might want to study and think about a little bit more for yourself. So on your notes here, you can see a number of these listed here. People have used observations about the universe. In other words, we just look around the universe and we think, how did it get that way? Or how do we describe or how do we explain that the universe is this way rather than that way? You know, God made us to be curious and to have the power, the ability of understanding the world around us. And so we want to do that, don't we? And so people have been looking at the universe and studying it as long as human beings have existed. But different observations here that we might use to make an argument for the existence of God. Number one, the beginning of the universe. I touched on this a little bit in session 1. The universe began to exist. And if it began to exist, that means it didn't cause itself to begin to exist, because that couldn't possibly have happened. That means something outside of the universe must have caused the universe to begin to exist. So we could point to that. A second observation would be the continued existence of the universe. Again, as we look at the universe around us, we see all kinds of things that do exist, but they don't have to exist. I mean, they could stop existing. We could point to the human race. I mean, the human race could get wiped out. Planet Earth could get wiped out. Stars, we see stars in the night sky around us, but you know, we've observed stars going out of existence at times. And so we see all these things that do exist, but they don't have to exist. And so that really does bring up the question, well, why do they keep on existing if they don't have to? What is keeping all of these contingent things in existence? So that's another observation. Number 3, the fine-tuning of the universe to allow for human life. Many different conditions about our universe have been discovered to be exactly what they need to be in order to allow human life to exist. You could think of an aquarium. I don't know if any of you have fish at your house, or probably all of us have at one time or another, right? We've all had some kind of failed experiment with fish in aquariums, right? Because sometimes it can be hard to keep those things alive. Depending on what kind of fish you get, there might be a lot of things you need to do to the water in order to create just the right conditions for that fish to survive. You know, some people have saltwater tanks in their house. Man, that is a challenge. You've got to monitor the salinity of that water. And then, the temperature of the water, make sure it's at the right temperatures and pH balance and all this stuff. And sometimes the lighting comes into effect and all that. You got to make sure the lighting is just right. Lots of different conditions have to be just what they are in that aquarium to allow for those fish to live, right? Well, what we've discovered as we've searched our universe is that the same kind of situation holds true for us as human beings. All kinds of different factors about the universe have to be precisely what they are, or otherwise the human race could not exist as we do. Now, how did that happen? How did that come to be? Who is the aquarium master, so to speak, who made sure that all the conditions were just right so that we could exist? So that's another observation that people have used. It's been a pretty popular one over the last couple of decades here. Number 4, purposeful activity in the universe by non-living things. We see all kinds of non-living things acting for a definite purpose and goal. Just think about the water cycle as one example. Okay, believe it or not, okay, this is wild, I know. There are places on Earth where there's water on the surface of the ground. Did you know that? Like lakes and rivers and oceans and stuff. It's wild, I know, but really, these places exist. But the whole water cycle gets going, and water evaporates from these sources of water, and it forms clouds in the sky, and the water in there condenses into raindrops that eventually fall back down to the earth. And it's inescapable when we look at this, that we think that's happening for the purpose of watering the animals and the plants that are on the ground, that dwell on the earth. But how could that be? Evaporation doesn't have a mind of its own. Water doesn't have a mind of its own. Clouds don't think. If no part of that whole cycle has a mind of its own, then who is directing all of this so that it accomplishes the goal that it is accomplishing? So that's another observation. Number 5 here, the existence of information in cells, DNA. DNA is literally an instruction manual for the body, telling the cells what to do and what to build with the proteins and the different elements that are presented to our cells. It's an instruction manual. Well, we know that those don't just come from nowhere. An instruction manual couldn't just randomly pop into existence. If we see information in our cells, where did that information come from? So people have used that as an observation. And then we could think about observations regarding human beings. Number 6 here, like the universal religious need within human beings. Human beings evidence a need to worship something greater than themselves. Hardly anyone in history has been able to live with the thought in their mind that there is no greater power overseeing everything. Because we just can't live with that thought. We know that we don't control everything. We are daily reminded of the fact that so much is out of our control. And so we need to know that someone is controlling it if we're going to have any sort of sense of peace of mind in our lives. And so the religious need that we evidence has been pointed to make an argument. C.S. Lewis did that rather famously. He pointed out some of the other needs we have, like we have a need for food. And lo and behold, there is food in the world. There's something to meet that need that we have. We have a need for water. Lo and behold, there is water in the world to meet that need. We have a need for air. Lo and behold, here is air that we can breathe. He says, if that's the case, then we come to see we have a need for God. What would we expect? Well, we would expect that, lo and behold, there is a God who meets the need that we have. Number 7 here, the religious experiences of human beings. Many people can report experiences like answered prayers, a situation that could not be explained any other way than as an answer to the prayers that people had been offering. Well, how do we explain that? Or many people throughout history have claimed to have experienced miracles, miraculous events, things that could have only happened by the agency of a supernatural power. Well, how do we explain that if there is no God? Or number 8 here, the existence of the soul. Our souls are a non-physical part of our being. So they could not have possibly been produced by a process of evolution, because evolution, it could only potentially work on physical objects. So where did this non-physical part of our being come from? We need to have a way to explain that as well. 9 and 10, observations about history. Again, we could talk about the occurrence of miracles. We'll focus on that more in session 4 as we talk about the miracle of the resurrection. Or number 10 here, the fulfillment of prophecy. How is it that the people who wrote the Bible could predict events with great specificity that then actually happened 700 years after they wrote the words? We know that human beings don't have that kind of power. We don't have that kind of foresight. We can't control the events of history so that our predictions come true. There has to be a power greater than that of humanity to explain something like that. So all of those are different observations that have been used at different times to argue for the existence of God. But as you already know, we're going to spend the rest of this session doing a deep dive on the moral argument for the existence of God. This is based on the observation that we as humans have a moral impulse about us. We know that we have obligations to treat other people in certain ways, and that we ought to avoid treating people in other certain ways. Well, where did all of this come from? Who could have possibly put an obligation on the entire human race? So that's the gist of what this argument is all about. We'll get into some more depth on it here, but the reason we're going to focus on this argument in this seminar is that this is an argument that I think people can not only understand, but they can feel the truthfulness of this argument as well. We all object when someone does harm to us, and we can't help it. We can't help but think this person should have known better and should have done better. And so, since we have all unfortunately, suffered harm at the hands of other people during our lives, we can feel just how true this argument is to reality. Okay. Now, I do like many of those different arguments for the existence of God, but some of them are like, think about the medical field example I used earlier. Some of the arguments are like at the brain surgery level, right? I mean, there's a lot of facts you have to learn about, maybe facts that you're not very familiar with in your everyday life. I think of maybe this argument from the fine-tuning of the universe. There's a lot of different scientific facts that go into that, and some of those, a lot of us just aren't all that familiar with. So it's a great argument, but it takes quite a bit to try to master the facts of that argument. With the moral argument here, that's not so much the case. It's pretty straightforward, really, as we'll see when we talk about it. But it's also then one that we can all feel at a pretty deep level in our souls. Okay, so the moral argument for the existence of God is this. You should see it there on your handout. Premise 1, if objective moral obligations exist, then God exists. In other words, if there are ways that we all ought to treat each other, then that could only be accounted for by a God who made us and who has the right then to tell us how we ought to live. That's the gist of premise 1, but we'll unpack that a little bit more as well. Premise 2 here, objective moral obligations do exist. The conclusion then, 3, therefore, God exists. Now, I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but premise 2 of this argument is actually the more controversial premise out of Numbers 1 and 2. Most people can see pretty quickly and easily that if there are objective moral obligations on our lives, only a God could be behind that. I mean, it's not like I could place moral obligations on your life that you ought to never violate, or that any human being has the right to enforce moral obligations on the rest of humanity that they shouldn't violate. No human being could put that kind of obligation on all other human beings. It has to be somebody who's above humanity. And so premise 1 actually has not been all that controversial, even among skeptics. It's premise 2 that has been more controversial, where people want to say, no, we really don't have objective moral obligations. Moral sensibilities are just relative to each individual or to whatever society you find yourself living in. So we'll have to talk about some of those observations here. All right. So in fact, that's what we're going to focus on. First of all, premise number 2, that objective moral obligations really do exist. And here by the word objective, I mean it in just the same sense that we used it in session number 2, when we talked about objective truth. That a true statement is true for all people at all times in all places. So here we're just applying that idea now to the moral sensibilities that we have as humans. That we have moral obligations that we ought to follow toward all other people at all times and in all situations. Okay. Now, how do we know that these objective moral obligations exist? Do we have good reason to think this? Well, as a matter of fact, we do. Let me give you 5 reasons here. In fact, number 1 is that we know from personal experience that these objective moral obligations exist. We have a moral sensibility ingrained in us that we can never turn off. It is active all the time. Whenever we hear about events that have occurred in the world around us, we don't find ourselves merely thinking, yes, that was true, yes, that event actually happened, or no, it's false, that event didn't happen. But we also find ourselves going ahead and saying, well, that was good, or that was evil, or that's how things ought to be, or, that's never how things ought to be. We are constantly making moral evaluations. Okay, just think about when you hear of an example of people helping each other, and you think, yes, this is good. Helping other people is good. This is how it ought to be. And in fact, you think this is how it always ought to be. People helping each other rather than harming each other. Think about a crowdfunding effort that perhaps you hear about on social media. I heard one of these heartwarming stories just a week or 2 ago. It involved an elderly man who, you hear a little bit about him and you think, man, I really wish he didn't have to work at this stage of his life, because what happened was he was captured on somebody's doorbell camera because he was working as a DoorDash worker. Do you hear about this? DoorDash, you can order food and somebody else will go pick it up for you and bring it to your house. And so he was working as a DoorDash driver. And the person whose order he filled captured a video of him on their doorbell camera. And, he was kind of tottering along the sidewalk there and had a little bit of a challenge getting up the steps onto their porch to deliver their food. And I believe after that, they were able to have a conversation with him. They're like, wow, sir, this seems like a rather challenging thing for you. Why are you doing this? And he explained that, well, he still needed to work because he and his wife had, in that case, they had some medical problems. And in order to pay some bills, this gentleman had to continue to work. And so this person said, you know what? I think I can do something to help this man out. So they started a crowdfunding effort. And you know how some of those things go sometimes. This one went viral, and all kinds of people started contributing money to help pay off their bills so that this man wouldn't have the pressure of continuing to work. But we hear about stories like that, and we think, yes, that's how it ought to be, right? We think, yes, helping someone. If we have the means to help another person to do good in his or her life, we ought to do that. And we would never even dream of saying, you know what, it would have been morally equivalent whether she chose to help him or whether she ran out and pushed him down the stairs. No, we wouldn't say that, those things are morally equal. No, we say she helped him, and that's how she ought to have responded. That was a good thing to do. Or on the flip side, we hear about stories that we say, man, that was evil. That should never happen to anyone. Think about some of these horrifically sad stories that we have heard in recent months about people being randomly attacked on public transportation. There was the young lady in North Carolina, I think it was, or one of the Carolinas, who got on a train and just was minding her own business and was just senselessly and ruthlessly attacked and murdered right there on the train. There have been other examples like that recently as well. And we hear about examples like that. And we say, no, that's wrong. That should never happen. And we can't even fathom that we would hear about that and say, you know what? Yeah, maybe I didn't prefer random violence on the subway on that occasion, but there might be a time where random violence on the subway is just fine. No. We can't even fathom having that response because we have this moral sensibility ingrained in us that we can never escape, we can never turn it off. And that's true even when we make moral evaluations about ourselves, because we do that all the time, don't we? We assess our own actions, and we think, yes, that was good. Or we say, you know what, that was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And what's interesting is that sometimes when we conclude that we did wrong, we feel guilty about that even if no other human being knows what we have done, don't we? Nobody else is aware of the action that we took, and yet we feel guilty about it. Well, why is that? We feel like someone is passing judgment on us about that choice. But who could that be? No other human being knows about it. The lazy boy you're sitting on is not passing judgment on you about that. You might pass judgment about all the dessert you've eaten, but that's a whole different thing. It's not making moral evaluations about you, and yet you feel that somebody is passing moral judgments. Well, who could that be? We have to have an answer for that detail of our human experience. Why do we feel guilty even when no one else knows what we have done? All right, so this is a powerful reason why we know that we have these subjective moral obligations. A second reason here, would be observations from human history and society. Observations from human history and society. Every society that's ever existed has had a moral code. Every society that exists around the world today has a moral code. And what's fascinating is when you dig down toward the foundational principles of these moral codes, they turn out to be stunningly similar. Now, that observation doesn't always seem obvious to people, because we do see surface level differences between different cultures, don't we? For example, you could think of our culture that says polygamy is immoral, but we know there have been other cultures, or even other cultures that exist in the world today, that allow polygamy and say, no, it's not morally wrong, it's morally acceptable. And so we might look at that and we might say, well, wow, these cultures, seem to have completely different ideas about marriage. Well, the fact is, they're not completely different. Because if we look past the details, what we discover is that even societies that might differ on something about like that, these societies still have boundaries around marriage. Even polygamous societies, they know how to draw a line between my wives and your wives, right? And they have ceremonies that initiate marriages between people, right? So that they have ways of marking off, okay, here's the boundaries of my marriage or marriages, and here are the boundaries of your marriages. And they have prescriptions against crossing the boundaries of somebody else's marital relationships. They still have the concept of adultery in their culture. So even though some of the surface level details are different, if we drill down into the foundational principles, we actually see more similarity than what the surface level differences might lead us to expect. Another perfect example, and these the Nazis always come up when people are talking about morality, right? And people might say, well, the Nazis didn't believe that murder was wrong. Our society believes murder is wrong. The Nazis didn't believe that murder was wrong. Oh, yes, they did. They absolutely believed that murder was wrong. Think about how they reacted when people tried to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Did they think that was right? No, they didn't think that was morally right. They thought that was morally wrong. The difference here was not in the foundational prescription against murder. If we define murder as the unjust ending of a human life, the Nazis agree with us on that all day long. They agree with us on that definition. The disagreements would be in what they consider unjust and in who they define as a human being. That's where the differences came. Okay, they said, well, no, the Jewish people are outside the pale of the human race. They're subhuman. We are a greater race than they are. They are below us, and so to take their lives is not unjust because of this difference in status. But again, when people tried to assassinate Hitler, they didn't say, oh, well, to each his own, I guess. I mean, well, we don't see anything wrong with murder, so I guess if they wanted to assassinate Hitler, that was fine. No, they objected to that. And so what that reveals is that they believe murder is wrong just like we do. Okay, so that foundational principle is the same. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with C.S. Lewis. In an appendix to his book, The Abolition of Man, he recorded moral observations from a wide number of different ancient civilizations in order to show how similar the moral codes of all these civilizations were. It's a really interesting resource to look at. Again, the book itself is titled The Abolition of Man. And it was in an appendix to that book that he made a lengthy record of moral agreements among ancient civilizations that at first glance appeared to be very different. But the foundational moral codes that they held were actually quite similar. All right, a third reason here. Here's this phrase again, self-defeating. It is self-defeating to make a moral argument against them. If you try to make a moral objection to objective moral obligations, it's self-defeating. This is the kind of objection that we hear when people say, you shouldn't push your morality on others. You shouldn't push your morality on someone else. What is that person doing? He is trying to push his moral standard on you while he makes that claim, right? He's doing the very thing he says ought not to be done. And so it's self-defeating to raise a moral objection against the idea of objective moral values. I hope you can see that now that we've talked about the idea of self-defeating claims a little bit. So we'll move on here to number 4. Okay? You cannot consistently live as if they are false, as if objective moral claims are false. You cannot consistently live that way. It's just like with objective truth and Justice Kennedy. You remember that? He espoused relativism with respect to truth in his opinion, but he would never live that way consistently himself. It's the same thing when someone tries to say that moral standards are relative. No one can consistently live that out. If you were mugged coming out of Walmart one evening, you would never think to yourself, man, how unfortunate that I crossed paths with somebody who has a different opinion of mugging than I do. You could never consistently live that out. You would think, what? No, they should have known better. And what does that imply? There is a moral standard that all people have access to that we should know about. He should have known better, and he should have done better. Even though you were perhaps a perfect stranger to that individual, you are convinced that he had a moral obligation toward you, and he violated that moral obligation. So we can never consistently live that out. As soon as an individual suffers harm, he ceases to be a moral relativist. That is just true for anyone and everyone. Okay? There is some button that you could push that would cause him to betray his claim of moral relativism in his behavior. Okay? And a fifth reason here, speaking of moral relativism is false. Just like in our last session, we were talking about objective truth. We made that argument, right? That truth is either objective or relative. It can't be both. It has to be one or the other. The same argument can be used here when we talk about moral relativism. Morality is either objective or relative. Morality is not relative, therefore morality is objective. Now, I note this book here. This is a fantastic book that is really, it's eminently readable. I mean, you could understand this book. This book is not beyond the grasp of any person here in this room. But Francis Beckwith and Greg Koukl wrote a book entitled Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. It's a wonderful book. I'd highly recommend that you get it. I think I wrote the title down there. If not, it's definitely in the bibliography at the end of your notes there. I'll put in a plug as well for Greg Koukl's ministry. He runs a ministry called Stand to Reason, and he produces a regular podcast and some different videos that go along with that. If you've ever run across Red Pen Logic with Mr. B online on social media somewhere, he's part Mr. B there, Tim Barnett. He's part of Greg Koukl's organization, Stand to Reason. That's a great apologetics organization if you need some more resources on things. But anyway, Francis Beckwith, Greg Koukl, they've written about the unacceptable results of moral relativism. And let me mention three of them for you here, okay? First, moral relativism leaves us with no clear answer to the question, relative to what? If moral values are not objective, if you say they're relative, well, relative to what exactly? There really is no ethical philosopher who will say that moral standards are relative to each individual, because obviously everyone sees that that just leads to moral chaos. And so it's more common for moral relativists to say, well, your moral standards are relative to the society that you live in. You are supposed to follow the moral standards of your society. Okay, so they would say, well, moral values are relative to your society. But how do we define what a society is? How do we draw the boundaries of that? Does your society have to be coextensive with your national boundaries? Is that what a society is? Just whoever lives in your particular nation? Or could my society be, like if I was a member of the mafia, could my society just be my own organized crime family? So like my morality is relative to whoever the mob boss wants me to knock off, today? Could my society be that? Or if me and a couple of buddies decide to, organize, we're going to go all Dalton gang here and we're going to start robbing banks, can my gang, can that be my society? Because they don't disapprove of me robbing banks. So why couldn't they be a society? There just is no clear answer to what the standards would be relative to. We could make our society anything that we would like it to be. Not only that, but we are all members of many different social groups. And sometimes our social groups have competing ideas about morality, don't they? For example, we are all part of a family, but we all are also part of a community, the people who live around us. We might also be members of certain clubs, maybe civic organizations, or maybe professional clubs. And sometimes all these different groups we're a part of have conflicting moral judgments, don't they? Well, if morality is relative, in those moments, we have no guide for whose moral value we're supposed to follow. If my family tells me I'm supposed to live one way, but my community tells me it's perfectly acceptable to live a different way. Well, how am I supposed to decide who's correct? Moral relativism leaves me with no basis for making that judgment. And that leads us to observation number 2 on this. Moral relativism would give us no basis for judging one society against another. No basis for judging one society against another. Let's think of the Nazis again. They're just always close to mind when we talk about morality, right? If moral relativism is true, we would have no grounds for criticizing what the Nazis did because we live outside their society, right? Not only, Americans back then lived outside their society. We really live outside their society now because, they were in the past. So if moral relativism is true, we could not legitimately say what they did was morally wrong and morally evil. And you might know this from history, but if you remember anything about the Nuremberg trials that were held after World War II, okay, these were trials in which the Allied armies rounded up as many of the officers of the Nazi Party as they could find, and they put them on trial for war crimes. And in those trials, the Nazis' defense was, you Allies have no right to put us on trial because you're not part of our society. You are an alien society trying to enforce your standards of morality upon us. We were part of our own society that gave us a moral compass, and according to the moral compass provided by our society, we have done nothing wrong. That was their defense in the Nuremberg trials. The Allies, on the other hand, said, no. Guess what? There is a universal moral code that transcends all societies, and you violated that. And because of that, we do have a basis for putting you on trial, finding you guilty of war crimes. We still hear about war crimes today, but it would be interesting to see if anything like the Nuremberg trials could still be adjudicated in our world today. We have things like the International Criminal Court and all that, which it just stands in an interesting contradiction with this whole idea of moral relativism that's also floating around there in the world. Because in order for something like the International Criminal Court to have any legitimacy, moral relativism has to be false. Has to be. It cannot be that morality is just relative to our society. All right. And then, number 3 here, moral relativism would leave us with, there we go. It would leave us with no possibility for improving a society. No possibility for improving a society. Because think about this. If my moral obligations are placed upon me by the society that I live in, I couldn't legitimately say that any detail of my society is morally wrong. Do you see that? Because the standard I have to use is whatever my society says is right. And so I couldn't then legitimately say, no, it's wrong. And so it's really fascinating that moral relativism rules out any possibility for moral improvement in a society. So we would ultimately have to conclude then that people who try to reform their societies would automatically be immoral. So people who are universally celebrated for pursuing improvements in their society, someone like a Mother Teresa. If moral relativism is true, she was immoral by trying to change the standards of her society. Because again, the standards of her society were supposedly what told her right from wrong. So there's that weird implication of moral relativism, that we couldn't improve a society if moral relativism is true. So it has to be false. And if moral relativism is false, then again, moral objectivism must be true. Now, one more vital detail to understand here real quick about moral standards is that they are obligations that are placed upon us. Moral values tell us how we ought to live. That word ought there, it's the language of a debt. Okay? I owe it to you to treat you a certain way. I owe it to you to refrain from treating you in harmful ways. And we know that we have that debt to any human being that we encounter, right? I mean, when we go out to the store, we're surrounded by people we don't know. Even still, we would think of them and say, I owe it to him to refrain from harming him. Or I owe it to him to be courteous to this person, even though he's a perfect stranger. Now, what this starts to tell us is that there has to be a third party in this interaction who's putting this obligation on both of us. Because if you are a perfect stranger to me, what have you ever given me that would put me in this kind of debt to you? We've never met each other before. You've never given anything to me. You've never done anything that would place me in your debt, and yet I know I have a moral obligation to you, a moral debt to you. What that tells us is my moral obligation actually is not to that stranger, it is to someone else who is above both of us. Do you see that? Does that make sense? Again, the fact that I know I have a moral obligation to a perfect stranger reveals that there is a third party in my interaction with the stranger. There has to be, because he has done nothing to put me into his debt. So that leads us right back to premise number one. And that's why even so many skeptics have granted this and said, yeah, it's just obvious that if objective moral standards exist or moral obligations exist, there has to be a God. God is the only one who could possibly put these moral standards on all of humanity. There's no other explanation for it. Or at least, most people would say there is no other explanation for it. But there is one other prominent theory in our culture about where we came from, isn't there? That would be the theory of evolution. And so let's finish this up with asking the question, could evolution explain objective morality? This might surprise you, but quite a few evolutionary philosophers would agree with us that morality is objective. Does that surprise you? They don't look at evolution, and again, I'm talking about ethical philosophers, people who've really tried to dig down to the foundations of morality and ethics. And there are evolutionary philosophers who would agree with us all day long that morality is objective. You know, some of your garden variety evolutionists have tried to use evolution to say anything goes morally. But serious ethical philosophers reject that, even if they're coming from an evolutionary perspective. So let's see what a philosopher named Michael Ruse has had to say about this. He's an evolutionary philosopher, and yet he believes morality is totally objective. We are not free to make up our own moral standards. We have moral obligations that are incumbent upon all of us. But how does he explain this? Well, notice some of these quotes here on your handout. First, he says, morality is no more, although certainly no less, than an adaptation, and as such has the same status as things like teeth and eyes and noses. So in other words, since you and I didn't get to decide whether we would have a nose, we also didn't get to decide what morality would be for us. And so maybe you can start to see the sense in which he is saying morality is objective. None of us got to decide that the normal human frame would have, 5 fingers on each hand. We didn't get to decide that. It was never up to us. And so he says, in the same way, the fact that we would have a sense of morality was never up to us either. All right, let's go on. He says, morality is a collective illusion of the genes, bringing us all in, except for the morally blind. We need to believe in morality, and so, thanks to our biology, we do believe in morality. There is no foundation for this out there beyond human nature. Okay? And then finally, let's look at this quote. Why should humans be thus deceived about the presumed objectivity of moral claims? The answer is easy to see. Unless we think morality is objectively true, a function of something outside of and higher than ourselves, it would not work. If I think I should help you when and only when I want to, I shall probably help you relatively infrequently. But because I think I ought to help you, because I have no choice about my obligation, it being imposed upon me, I am much more likely, in fact, to help you. Hence, by its very nature, ethics is and has to be something which is apparently objective, even though we now know that truly it is not. So, in other words, what he believes is that a sense of morality has simply helped us survive. Because remember, according to evolution, everything comes down to survival of the fittest, right? The organisms that survive to perpetuate their own genes, those are the organisms that are going to define the future of biological development, right? And so what he's saying is, look, if we didn't think that we should be moral to each other, we would have just killed each other off long ago. But we have this evolutionary adaptation where we feel like we should treat each other well. And that has allowed us to avoid wiping ourselves out as history has gone by. He says, it's an illusion, however, but it's been a helpful illusion that's allowed us to survive and reproduce and create more human beings who also have this illusory sense of objective morality. But there are 2 key problems with so-called objective morality from evolution. First, our moral obligations could have been different, and they could still change. In other words, if they were just a product of evolution, they wouldn't be true for all people at all times. Okay? Evolutionary philosophers have to admit that just as evolution could have played out such that we have, 4 fingers instead of 5, evolution could have also played out in such a way that would have made us think that something like, random violence on the subway is morally good. Remember, there's no rhyme or reason to what evolution has produced. It's just sort of luck of the draw based on whatever has helped someone survive. And so they freely admit that if evolution had just played out differently, well, we might believe that rape is perfectly okay. We might believe that murder is perfectly okay, just if evolution had played out differently. And that also means that as evolution supposedly continues, we might still grow to a place where we think murder is totally okay, morally acceptable. And then Ruse alluded to this second one himself in what he said, is that if our moral sensibility is just a product of evolution, our moral obligations wouldn't be obligations after all. He said it himself. It's just a collective illusion of the genes. We feel like we're obligated to treat each other well, but in reality, we are not obligated to treat each other well. Because who would hold us to that obligation? There's no God who holds us to that obligation. So the obligation we think we have is just an illusion. And if that's the case, then now that we know evolution just played this trick on us, there's no reason why we need to be moral any longer. Like he said in there, talk about helping your neighbor. Now that I know that my impulse to help my neighbor is just an illusion, I don't have any obligation to follow that anymore. What if I come to believe that I've actually reached a higher plane of evolutionary development than my neighbor has? I might think, well, hey, the human race would be better served if my neighbor was gone. Or if, arrangements were made such that my neighbor could not pass on his inferior genetics to a new generation. If you've ever heard of the eugenics programs that were carried out in the United States in the early 1900s, this kind of evolutionary thinking is exactly what was behind that. Have you ever heard of those forced sterilization programs that were carried out in the United States? If you never heard of that, you ought to look them up. You ought to look them up because we see the deranged things that have happened in our own country and could actually happen again, okay, if we don't stand strong against such things. But it was based on that belief that certain people in society had inferior genetics, and society as a whole would be better off if those people never reproduced. And so state-sponsored programs forcibly sterilized human beings so that they couldn't reproduce. But again, if morality is just an illusion foisted upon us by evolution, there's not a thing wrong with that. And in fact, the eugenicists might have been correct. Okay, that's a bone-chilling thing to think about. But evolution absolutely cannot explain the objective moral obligations that we have to each other. So the main competing theory to creationism in our society cannot explain the details of human experience. So since that's the case, it's false. It cannot explain the full experience that we have as human beings. So we ought to reject evolution and consider its alternative, that we are made by a God, and it is God alone who can put obligations on all of humanity. All right, let's see if you have a couple of questions here before we take one more break and then get into our final session. Any questions on your mind here? Okay, if not, well, let's take a break of about 7 or 8 minutes here, and then we'll get into our final session for the day.